Everyone treats South Park as a show that has never faced a real consequence. Fans laugh off each controversy as free publicity. Critics say it got too big to touch. The people who actually tried to shut it down were not writing angry letters. In this video, we break down every real attempt to cancel South Park, the religious organization, Scientology, Tom Cruise, and Trapped in the Closet. On November 16, 2005, an episode of a cartoon aired on basic cable and quietly set fire to one of the most protected reputations in Hollywood. The episode was called Trapped in the Closet, and it did something almost nobody with a lawyer had been willing to do on television. It laid out the actual private beliefs of the Church of Scientology, on screen, in cartoon form, with a little caption running along the bottom letting viewers know that this was what Scientologists believe. The story itself was simple enough. Stan takes a free personality test, gets told his thetan levels are off the charts, and finds himself declared the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard. Church officials swarm his house. Celebrity members show up to pay respects. And one of those celebrities, a cartoon version of Tom Cruise, ends up so wounded by Stan's lack of enthusiasm that he locks himself inside Stan's bedroom closet and refuses to come out no matter how many people beg him to. John Travolta joins him in there. So does R. Kelly. By the end, an entire crowd is standing outside a child's closet door pleading with grown men to come out, and every single person watching understood what the joke was. The show had already made fun of Mormons, Catholics, Jews, evangelical Christians, and Jesus Christ personally, who at that point had his own local cable access talk show inside the world of the series. Nothing had happened. No advertiser fled. No network executive panicked. Religion had been a target on this show since almost the first season, and the sky had stayed exactly where it was. The Mormon episode is the useful comparison, because it did structurally the same thing a year and a half earlier. That episode walks through the founding story of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in detail, with the same running caption device laying out the account of the golden plates and the seer stones and what happened to the first manuscript. It presents the events plainly and lets the audience react. Then, at the very end, it does something the Scientology episode does not do, which is give the Mormon character a speech, pointing out that the boys have spent the whole time laughing at a story while ignoring the fact that his family is kind, functional, and happy, and that this might be the part worth paying attention to. The church did not organize against it. There were individual complaints, as there always are, but no campaign, no press operation, no demand for removal, and no attempt to reach anyone at the parent company. The episode aired, reran, and remains available today. Same show, same technique, same subject matter, completely different outcome, entirely because of how the organization on the receiving end chose to respond. Scientology turned out to be a different animal entirely. Part of the reason had nothing to do with faith and everything to do with fear. Before the episode was even written, Penn Jillette had wanted to make an episode of his own television show about Scientology, and Showtime told him no, specifically to avoid the chance of legal action from the church. Trey Parker later described hearing that as the exact thing that guaranteed the episode would get made. Being told a subject is off limits was, for him and Matt Stone, closer to a dare than a warning. So they made it, and Comedy Central publicly backed them while they did. What nobody at the network seemed to fully calculate was that one of their own cast members had been sitting inside the church the entire time. Isaac Hayes was not a small piece of South Park. He was the voice of Chef, the school cook, the only adult in town who ever gave the boys a straight answer about anything, and one of the most beloved characters the series ever produced. He had been there since the beginning. He was also, in real life, a practicing Scientologist, and he had never once complained about anything the show did to any other religion across 8 full seasons. In the week after Trapped in the Closet aired, Parker and Stone sat down with him. By their account, he was very upset. They told him it was nothing personal, that this was simply what the show was, and that skipping Scientology after everything else they had gone after would have made a joke out of every target that came before it. Then months passed and nothing happened, and it seemed like the whole thing had settled. On March 13, 2006, a press release went out announcing that Isaac Hayes was leaving South Park. The statement blamed the show's intolerance toward religious beliefs and its growing appetite for mocking faith. It never actually used the word Scientology. It did not have to. Everyone reading it filled in the blank on their own. Matt Stone's response was immediate and blunt. He said the situation had everything to do with Hayes and his own faith, pointing out that Hayes had no problem whatsoever with the show making fun of Christians, and that he and Parker had never heard a single complaint from him about anything until Scientology came up. He argued that wanting a different standard for one's own religion than the one applied happily to everyone else's is the exact place where bigotry begins. What almost nobody outside the situation knew at the time was how much organized effort had gone on behind that statement. Internal documents from within the church, which surfaced publicly years afterward, describe a coordinated response in the days around the announcement. According to that material, Hayes placed a call directly to Doug Herzog, the president of Comedy Central, specifically to press him not to air the episode again. Herzog was on a plane plane at the time, so a message was left. The account describes Hayes preparing to tell the network head exactly how angry he was about who the show had consulted while researching the episode, and about not being consulted himself. The same material describes Hayes then speaking to Parker and Stone directly, raising the same complaint about their sources, with both of them distancing themselves from the person in question. None of that was visible from outside. What the public saw was a press release. What was actually happening was a campaign with phone calls, talking points, and a specific list of objectives, of which the resignation was only the most visible part. The effort to stop the rerun was running in parallel with the effort to announce the departure, and both were pointed at the same building. That would have been a strange enough ending on its own. What came out later made it stranger. Isaac Hayes had suffered a stroke in January 2006, 2 months before the statement went out under his name. At the time, a Fox News columnist reported that Hayes was not in any condition to have quit on his own. Years later, Hayes' own son said plainly that the statement had been written without his father's knowledge, that his father had not recovered from the stroke, and that representatives of the church had made the decision on his behalf. According to that account, the man whose name was on the resignation had no personal objection to the joke at all. The show killed Chef off, and the way it did that is worth going through carefully, because it is one of the more pointed things the series has ever done. The episode aired on March 22, 2006, roughly 9 days after the resignation statement went out. That timeline is remarkable on its own. A show that takes about a week to produce an episode had turned around a full response to a real-world event involving one of its own cast members, written it, animated it, and put it on television inside of 2 weeks. Hayes had not recorded any new dialogue, so there was none to use. What the writers did instead was go back through 8 seasons of existing recordings and cut together individual words and phrases into new sentences. The result is a version of Chef who speaks in a slightly disjointed way, sometimes changing tone mid-sentence, because every line is assembled from pieces recorded years apart for completely unrelated scenes. The plot has Chef returning to South Park after a long absence, behaving strangely and speaking in unsettling ways to the children. It emerges that he has fallen in with a shadowy organization called the Super Adventure Club, whose members travel the world and have some disturbing ideas, and that the group has taken hold of him completely. The boys try to get him back. They partially succeed. Then he dies in an extended sequence involving a fall from a bridge, a mauling by animals, and a strike of lightning, one indignity after another, stacked past the point of sense. The eulogy at the end is the part that matters. The boys stand up and say that they refuse to be angry at Chef, because the person saying those things at the end was not really Chef at all. It was the people who got inside his head and made him say them. They say they want to remember him as he was before that happened. Read as a piece of storytelling about a fictional cook, it is a strange and violent ending. Read as a statement about what the writers believed had happened to Isaac Hayes, it is gentle. They did not attack him. They built an entire episode arguing that the man they had worked with for 8 years had been taken over by an organization, and that the words attributed to him were not his. Given what Hayes' own son said years later about who actually wrote that resignation statement, the episode turned out to be closer to accurate than anyone watching in 2006 could have known. 2 days after the Hayes announcement went public, the second half of the story landed. Comedy Central had a rerun of Trapped in the Closet scheduled. On the night it was supposed to air, the network abruptly pulled it and put something else on instead. The official explanation was that this was a tribute to Isaac Hayes following his departure, which meant the network's stated reason for hiding the Scientology episode was respect for the Scientologist who had just quit over it. Almost nobody believed that. Sources connected to the show told reporters that the rerun had been canceled because Tom Cruise had threatened to walk away from his promotional duties for Mission Impossible 3. That mattered because of a corporate detail most viewers never think about. Comedy Central was owned by Viacom. Paramount Pictures, the studio releasing Mission Impossible 3, was also owned by Viacom. One of the biggest movies of the year was about to come out under the same corporate roof as the cartoon making fun of its star. Representatives for Cruise and for the studio denied the whole thing. Parker and Stone did not bother with a denial or a discussion. They released a single statement through their lawyer, written as if they were addressing an intergalactic warlord directly, congratulating Scientology on winning this particular battle and announcing that the million-year war for Earth had only just begun. They signed it as servants of the Dark Lord Xenu. That statement got picked up everywhere. So did the story behind it. And this is the part that keeps happening across every single one of these fights, over and over, for nearly 30 years. The attempt to bury the episode made the episode enormous. Before March 2006, Trapped in the Closet was a well-liked episode from a season that had already ended. After March 2006, it was the episode that Tom Cruise supposedly got yanked off television, which meant every person who had never watched South Park in their life suddenly wanted to know what was in it. News networks ran segments explaining the plot. Newspapers printed summaries of the beliefs the episode had laid out, the exact material the church had spent decades keeping quiet quiet got repeated on national television by anchors in suits for free because somebody tried to make it disappear. Then it got worse for everyone involved. In July 2006, the episode picked up an Emmy nomination for Best Animated Program. A cartoon that had been pulled off the air 4 months earlier was now nominated for one of the biggest awards in television, and every article about the nomination reminded readers exactly why it had been pulled in the first place. Parker and Stone went after the network in public. Speaking at a press event that same month, Parker summed the situation up by noting that there were now exactly 2 things they were not allowed to put on Comedy Central: Muhammad and Tom Cruise. They said they had no doubt the episode had been yanked because of Mission Impossible 3, and they said it in a room full of television critics who wrote it all down. Comedy Central put the episode back on the air on July 19, 2006. The whole sequence had lasted about 4 months and accomplished the exact opposite of what it was meant to accomplish. The episode was more famous, more watched, more discussed, and now decorated with an award nomination. The church had gained nothing, the studio had gained nothing, and the show had gained one of the best stories in its history, which it would go on to reuse in future episodes for years. There is one more piece to it, and it is the piece that makes the entire effort look the most pointless in hindsight. Jenna Miscavige Hill, the niece of the leader of the Church of Scientology, has said that she first learned the Xenu story by watching that episode. She had grown up inside the church, in the family at the very top of it, and a cartoon on Comedy Central was where she found out what the organization actually taught. She left not long after and became one of its most public critics. That is what the suppression campaign produced. A pulled rerun that everyone noticed, a resignation letter that the man's own son later said his father did not write, an Emmy nomination, 4 months of free national publicity for the exact information the church wanted buried, and a member of the founding family walking out the door. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this breakdown, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Scientology at least had the advantage of surprise. Nobody had ever gone after South Park like that before, and the network did not know how to handle it. The next group to come after the show had been doing this professionally for years, with a press office, a mailing list, and a president who gave interviews. They picked their moment carefully. They picked a holy day. Section 2, the Advocacy Group, the Catholic League, and Bloody Mary. The Season 9 finale went out on December 7, 2005, which was 3 weeks after the Scientology episode, and roughly the worst possible date the writers could have chosen if they had been trying to avoid a fight. December 7 is the eve of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, one of the most significant days on the Catholic calendar, and a day tied specifically and directly to the Virgin Mary. The episode was called Bloody Mary. The plot was about alcoholism. Randy Marsh gets pulled over for drunk driving, gets sentenced to Alcoholics Anonymous, and comes away from his first meeting convinced that he has an incurable disease and is therefore powerless to do anything about his own behavior. He stops trying entirely. He starts drinking more, not less, because a disease is not something a person can be blamed for. Stan spends the rest of the episode trying to explain to his father that he is not sick, he simply drinks too much, and that the difference matters hugely. Meanwhile, in a nearby town, a statue of the Virgin Mary begins bleeding. Word spreads that the statue is producing miracles. Sick people travel from all over to be healed by it. Randy hears about it and decides that this is his cure, that a miracle is the only thing that can save a man with an incurable disease. He gets sprayed by the statue. He declares himself healed. Then the Pope shows up to examine the statue personally, gets sprayed himself, takes a close look at the anatomy involved, and announces that the statue is not bleeding from where everyone assumed. He rules that it is coming out of a different part of the body entirely, which means it is not a miracle at all, just an unpleasant plumbing situation. The crowd disperses. Randy's cure evaporates, and Stan finally gets his father to admit that nothing was ever going to fix this, except Randy deciding to drink less. The point of the episode was that treating a choice like a disease gives people permission to stop making better choices. The vehicle for that point was a bleeding statue and a papal inspection, and that vehicle is what people remembered. That mismatch between subject and packaging is the thing almost every campaign in this story runs into, and it is worth stating plainly before going any further. Not one of the statements issued against this episode engaged with the argument it was making. Nobody addressed the claim about how addiction is discussed, whether it was fair or whether the show had got it wrong. The entire public conversation was about a single image, and specifically about which part of a statue's anatomy the fluid was emerging from. That is not a failure on the part of the critics. It is a structural feature of how outrage works. An argument about personal responsibility and disease models takes several minutes to explain and does not fit in a press release. A bleeding statue of the Virgin Mary fits in 4 words and requires no explanation at all. Any campaign that needs to move quickly will always reach for the image because the image is what travels. The consequence is that the episode's actual content became irrelevant to the fight about it almost immediately. Millions of people who never watched it learned that South Park had done something obscene involving the Virgin Mary, and that is now the entire public public memory of a story about a man refusing to admit he drinks too much. The Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights issued its response on December 8, the day after the broadcast and the feast day itself. Its president, Bill Donahue, had been running that organization for years and knew exactly how to turn a television segment into a national story. He called the episode one of the most vile things ever to appear on television. He made a point of noting that the network had chosen to air it on the eve of the Holy Day and on the Holy Day itself, treating the timing as a deliberate insult rather than a scheduling accident. Then he made his actual demands, and the demands were specific in a way that most outrage campaigns never are. He wanted Viacom to issue a formal apology to Roman Catholics. He wanted a pledge that the episode would be permanently retired, never aired again in any form, and he wanted it kept off the DVD release, which meant he was not just asking for the episode to be pulled from television, he was asking for it to stop existing as a purchasable object. He also did something clever. Rather than aiming his complaint at Comedy Central, where it would have been absorbed by a communications department and forgotten in a week, he aimed it at a specific human being sitting on the board of directors of the parent company. Joseph A. Califano Jr. was a distinguished figure, a former cabinet secretary, and a practicing Catholic. Donahue asked him to personally seek the apology and the permanent retirement of the episode. If Califano would not do that, Donahue asked him to at least issue his own public condemnation instead. That request reached Califano on December 9. That same evening, he released a statement. He said he had watched the segment about the Blessed Mother, that he found it an appalling and disgusting portrayal of the Virgin Mary, and that he was particularly troubled as a Roman Catholic that it had run on the eve of and the day of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. He then said he had spoken with Tom Freston, the president and chief executive of Viacom, and asked him to review the show and decide whether any action should be taken, adding clearly that the decision belonged to Freston and not to him. Donahue immediately declared that Califano had not let them down and said publicly that they were now waiting on Freston's response. The pressure kept building from there. Bishop William Skylestad, who at the time was president of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, sent a letter directly to Freston saying the network had shown extreme insensitivity in airing the episode. That letter mattered because it moved the complaint out of the hands of a single advocacy group and into the hands of the formal leadership of American Catholicism. Now the parent company of Comedy Central was fielding objections from its own board member, from a national bishops conference, and from a professional advocacy organization that was releasing new statements roughly every few days. Comedy Central re-aired every episode of Season 9 on December 28, 2005 as a year-end marathon. Every episode except one, Bloody Mary, was gone. Then on December 29th, an executive vice president at Comedy Central called the Catholic League directly and told them there were no plans to rerun the episode. The next day, that was reported publicly as the network pulling the rerun. Donahue took the victory lap immediately. He put out a release commending Comedy Central for finally making the right decision, while adding that the episode airing in the first place did not speak well of the people who created it. He also mentioned that his organization was being flooded with hate mail and framed the entire campaign as nothing more than exercising a First Amendment right to ask a network not to offend Catholics again. For about a week, it looked like a total win. A national campaign had gone after a single episode of a cartoon, escalated it through a corporate board and a bishops conference, and gotten the episode taken off the air, and then the whole thing came apart. Comedy Central, responding to viewer emails about the episode's fate, told people that Bloody Mary had not been retired and would not be pulled from the DVD release. So the single biggest demand, the one about permanent erasure, was already dead. The episode was going to be sold in a box set regardless of what anyone at Viacom had said on the phone. The clip stayed online too. Even while the rerun was being pulled from the broadcast schedule, the show's own official website was still hosting clips from the episode, available to anyone with an internet connection and 30 seconds of curiosity. The network had quietly removed the episode from a television marathon while leaving it fully accessible everywhere else. Then the episode came back to television anyway. Comedy Central eventually reran the thing it had told the Catholic League it would not rerun, which produced another furious statement from Donahue years later, this time accusing the network of reneging on its promise and calling the people who worked there cowards for refusing to show an image of Muhammad while happily airing a bleeding Virgin Mary. That second complaint is worth noting because it is one of the very few times a critic of the show and the creators of the show were making the exact same argument about Comedy Central at the same time, for completely opposite reasons. The strangest chapter of the whole thing happened on the other side of the world. In New Zealand, a channel called C4 announced it would air the episode, and the campaign against it escalated further than anything that had happened in the United States. Catholic groups organized immediately. The objection was the same one Donahue had raised, but the tactics went further because the target was a much smaller broadcaster with far less ability to absorb pressure. An advertiser pulled its advertising advertising from the broadcaster's networks entirely, which is the outcome every one of these campaigns aims for and almost never achieves. A Catholic organization called Family Life International set up a dedicated website for the specific purpose of organizing boycotts against the remaining advertisers, turning a single episode of a cartoon into a sustained commercial pressure campaign against a national television company. Then the situation produced something absurd. On the eve of the broadcast, a company called C4 Productions applied to a court for an order stopping the episode from airing. That company had no connection to the television channel and no involvement in the dispute over religious content. Its argument was that viewers might confuse the two organizations because of the shared name and that its own business would suffer as a result of being associated with the controversy. So the final legal attempt to stop the episode in New Zealand was not made by a church, a broadcasting authority, or an advocacy group. It was made by a company worried about a naming coincidence. The judge ruled against the order. The episode aired on February 22, 2006, and pulled in 210,000 viewers. That number was roughly 6 times the audience South Park normally drew on that channel. That is the entire campaign summarized in a single statistic. Months of organized protest, an advertiser boycott, a court filing, and national press coverage, and the direct measurable result was that 6 times more people watched the episode than would have watched it if everyone had simply ignored it. The show itself never blinked. Bloody Mary sat on the DVD. It came back to television. It went on to streaming services years later, and the Catholic League has remained one of the show's most reliable critics ever since, which Parker and Stone have talked about openly, noting that the organization is essentially always on their case. That relationship is worth understanding, because it explains why this particular fight looked the way it did, rather than looking like the Scientology fight. The Catholic League operated in public, permanently, as a matter of design. It issued statements constantly, on television programs, films, advertisements, comedians, and news coverage, and it did so with a press operation built for exactly that purpose. Being condemned by it was not a rare event for anyone working in American entertainment. It was closer to routine, and the entertainment industry had long since learned to treat it as weather rather than as a threat. That constant volume is a strength and a weakness at the same time. It means the organization can generate coverage on any subject within a day, which is how a single episode of a cartoon ended up being discussed by a Viacom board member and a bishops' conference inside 72 hours. It also means the coverage tends to evaporate at the same speed, because there is always another statement about something else arriving right behind it. The Scientology campaign had worked differently. It was quiet. It was targeted at specific individuals with specific commercial leverage, and it produced a result within days without a single public statement about wanting the episode removed. The Catholic campaign was loud, public, and comprehensive, and it produced one schedule change that reversed itself. Parker and Stone have never treated the difference as a mystery. Their consistent position across decades is that religious organizations are entitled to be furious about anything they want, that being furious is part of how a free society works, and that none of it obligates anyone to stop making things. The show has gone on to build entire episodes around Catholic institutions in the years since, some of them considerably harsher than a bleeding statue, and none of those produced anything close to the reaction this one did. Timing had been the only real weapon in the whole campaign. Airing on the eve of a major feast day is what turned an ordinary complaint into a national story, and once that timing was in the past, the story had nothing left to run on. What that whole fight really exposed is how little leverage anyone actually has over a cartoon that costs relatively little to make and prints money for the people who own it. The campaign got a phone call and a schedule change. It did not get the apology. It did not get the DVD pulled. It did not get the episode retired. It got one marathon slot and a temporary win that reversed itself, in exchange for handing the episode more publicity than the show's own marketing department could have bought. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this breakdown, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Outside groups pushing in had been the shape of every fight so far. The next one came from inside the building. Comedy Central was about to start censoring its own biggest show, on its own initiative, with black boxes and title cards, and Parker and Stone were about to spend the next 4 years dragging their own network for it on live television. Section 3. The network itself. Comedy Central and Cartoon Wars. In April 2001, an episode called Super Best Friends aired with almost no reaction whatsoever. The plot involved David Blaine building a cult around cheap magic tricks, and Stan calling in a team of religious figures to stop him. The team included Jesus, Buddha, Moses, Krishna, Joseph Smith, Lousy, a character called Seaman, and Muhammad, who was drawn as a superhero with the power to shoot flame. He had a costume, he had a catchphrase, he stood in a lineup with 7 other religious founders and helped fight a magician. Nobody complained. The episode aired, reran, sat on the DVD, and lived a completely ordinary life for years. At the time, the idea that this specific character in this specific lineup would eventually become the most most legally and physically dangerous thing the show had ever produced would have sounded absurd. Then came September 2005, and a Danish newspaper published a set of 12 cartoons depicting Muhammad. The publication began as something small and specifically local. A Danish author had reported difficulty finding an illustrator willing to work on a children's book about the life of Muhammad, and the newspaper commissioned the cartoons as a response to what its editors described as a growing habit of self-censorship. It ran in one paper, in one country, with a population of around 5 million people. For several months, almost nothing happened outside Denmark. Then the story began to travel, and once it reached a wider audience, the escalation was fast and enormous. By early 2006, there were protests across multiple continents. There were boycotts of Danish products. There were attacks on embassies. People died in the resulting violence in several countries. Governments issued statements. Diplomats were recalled. News organizations around the world then faced a decision they had never had to make before at that scale, which was whether to reprint the images while reporting on the story about the images. A handful did. The overwhelming majority did not. What Parker and Stone noticed was not the decision itself. It was the language used to explain it. Nearly every organization that declined to reprint gave a reason involving respect, sensitivity, and a desire not to cause unnecessary offense. Very few of them said the obvious thing, which is that they were afraid of what might happen to their staff. That gap between the stated reason and the actual reason is a specific kind of dishonesty, and it is the exact thing this show has always gone after hardest. A person who says they are staying quiet out of respect when they are staying quiet out of fear has not just made a decision, they have also lied about why, and the lie makes the situation worse, because it disguises how much ground has actually been given up. The subject had gone from a non-issue to the single most sensitive thing in Western media, and it happened over the course of a few months. Parker and Stone noticed something specific in how that played out. Every outlet that declined to run the images gave a reason about respect and sensitivity. Almost none of them said the honest thing, which is that they were afraid. That gap between the stated reason and the real reason became the entire subject of the next thing they made. In April 2006, they aired a two-part story called Cartoon Wars. The setup was that Family Guy had announced an upcoming episode featuring Muhammad, and the entire country was panicking about the retaliation. Cartman, who hates Family Guy for reasons that have nothing to do with religion, sees an opportunity. He travels to Hollywood to get the episode pulled, pretending the whole time that his motive is protecting people from violence, when his actual motive is that he wants a show he dislikes taken off the air. Kyle chases him across the country to stop him, because Kyle understands that letting one thing get pulled over the possibility of anger makes everything else negotiable too. The argument Kyle makes at the end of the second part is the thesis of the whole show. Either it is all okay or none of it is. A system where some targets are protected and others are not cannot hold, because the moment it exists, the only thing determining what gets protected is who is willing to threaten. The episodes were built to end with Family Guy actually airing the scene, with Muhammad appearing on screen, handing someone a salmon helmet. It was a deliberately boring, deliberately harmless image. That was the point. The joke was supposed to be that after all the panic and all the buildup, the offending picture is somebody politely passing over a fish hat. Comedy Central refused to air it. What went out instead was a black title card, sitting over the moment where the image was supposed to be, with text explaining that the network had refused to broadcast a picture of Muhammad. That card is an unusual object in the history of television. Censorship on television is normally invisible by design. A scene gets trimmed in the edit, and nobody watching has any way of knowing something was removed. A word gets bleeped, which announces that something happened but not what. Occasionally, a program is pulled entirely, which announces everything at once but is rare and expensive. A written statement in the middle of an episode explaining that the network has refused to show what was supposed to be there is essentially none of those. It is the network narrating its own decision to the audience in real time. Comedy Central could have simply cut the sequence. The episode would have functioned. Viewers would have noticed a slightly abrupt edit and moved on, and there would have been no story. Instead, the network chose to document the removal on screen, in writing, and let millions of people read it live. Nobody has ever fully explained why. The most likely answer is that the alternative was worse. Quietly cutting the scene would have meant lying by omission to an audience that included a very large number of people who knew what was supposed to be there, and Parker and Stone would have said so publicly within a day. The card was the only option that did not involve pretending. Right after that black card, the episode continues with a scene it was allowed to broadcast in full. Terrorists respond with a cartoon of their own, in which Jesus defecates on the President of the United States and on the American flag. That scene ran uncensored. It was animated in detail and aired without a single objection from anyone at the network. So the episode that Comedy Central censored for religious sensitivity aired a graphic joke about Jesus and the American flag about 10 seconds later, completely untouched. That contrast was not an accident. Parker and Stone had built built the episode, knowing there was a real chance the network would cut the Muhammad image, and they structured the ending so that if it happened, the censorship itself would prove Kyle's speech correct in front of the audience. The network walked directly into the trap because there was no way for it not to. Airing the image meant taking on a security risk. Cutting it meant demonstrating live that the show's argument was right. Comedy Central chose to be proven right rather than take the risk, and the episode became famous for it. The creators were not quiet about how they felt. In interviews around that period, and for years afterward, they made the same point repeatedly, that the network treated every religion on Earth as fair game and carved out exactly one exception, and that the exception existed because of fear rather than principle. That summer, at a press event, Parker delivered the line that followed them for the next decade, that there were now two things they were not permitted to show on Comedy Central: Muhammad and Tom Cruise. The network never really had a good answer, because there was not one available. Every honest explanation involved admitting that the decision was about safety, and admitting that publicly would have confirmed that threats were. There is a detail buried in the timeline that makes the whole situation stranger. Super Best Friends had been sitting in the rerun rotation for 5 years at this point, with Muhammad in it, in a costume, with a power set. Comedy Central had been airing that episode over and over without a single incident. The network was simultaneously blocking a new depiction while continuing to broadcast an old one, because nobody had connected the two yet. That eventually got noticed, and Super Best Friends started disappearing from broadcast in 2006 as well, quietly, without an announcement. An episode that had been completely uncontroversial for half a decade became untouchable retroactively, not because anything in it changed, but because the world around it did. What Cartoon Wars really established was a pattern that would repeat itself in a much uglier form 4 years later. The show would go after the exact thing everyone was afraid of. The network would flinch, the flinch would become the story, and the audience would end up learning more about how television actually works from a cartoon than from any of the news organizations covering it. There was one more piece of fallout that nobody expected, and it involved the half of the episode most people remember better than the censorship half. Cartoon Wars is also, from beginning to end, an extended attack on Family Guy. The attack is not a passing joke. It is a sustained argument delivered across 2 episodes, and it is unusually specific for something aimed at a competitor. Cartman's stated objection is that Family Guy has no actual jokes in it, only interruptions, and that its humor has no relationship to anything happening in its own story. He argues that the show could reorder its scenes at random without changing anything, because nothing in it connects to anything else. Then the episode goes to the writer's room to prove the point and reveals that Family Guy is written by manatees. The manatees live in a tank containing a set of balls, each ball printed with a random word or concept. The animals nudge balls into a chute, more or less at random, and whatever combination emerges becomes the next cutaway gag. There is no thought involved and no intention. There is a tank, a set of nouns, and an animal moving them around. When a network executive later tries to force the manatees to insert a specific idea, they refuse to work because introducing intent breaks the system entirely. That is one of the most direct and least deniable attacks one television program has ever made on another. It does not merely say a rival show is bad. It describes a mechanical process by which the rival show is allegedly produced, and the description is detailed enough that viewers could apply it themselves while watching. The response from the other side is the part that puts every campaign in this story into perspective. Seth MacFarlane, the creator of Family Guy, later described the episode as funny and accurate. That reaction says something about the difference between how the industry handled this and how everyone else did. The person actually being insulted laughed. The people who had never been targeted at all were the ones demanding removals. The reaction outside the show was mixed in a way that surprised almost nobody involved. Free expression organizations and a good number of critics wrote about the black title card as a significant moment, arguing that a network publicly documenting its own act of censorship inside the program being censored was something television had essentially never done before. Whatever else it was honest. Comedy Central could have quietly cut the scene and let the episode run without explanation, and most viewers would never have known anything was missing. Others argued the opposite, that putting the card on screen was a way of shifting responsibility. The network got to look transparent while still doing the thing, and got to blame the situation rather than the decision. Both readings are defensible, and the network never really picked one. Comedy Central declined to elaborate publicly, which was the pattern it would follow every single time this came up over the next 20 years. The position was effectively that there was no position, and that no comment would be forthcoming, and that anyone who wanted an explanation could work it out for themselves. Parker and Stone were never going to let that stand quietly, and they did not. The Muhammad question stayed in their public commentary for years afterward. They raised it at press events. They raised it in interviews about unrelated things. They raised it whenever a journalist asked about creative freedom, because the answer was always the same and it was always sitting right there. Cartoon Wars ran, got talked about for a few weeks, and then faded into the background as one more controversial thing on a show made entirely of controversial things. Comedy Central had held the line, avoided any real consequences, and moved on. Parker and Stone had made their point about censorship and lost the fight. For 4 years, that was the end of it. The show went back to normal. The Muhammad question seemed settled in the sense that everyone had quietly agreed to leave it alone, and the black title card sat in the archive as a slightly embarrassing artifact of a nervous moment. Then the show hit its 200th episode, and the writers decided that was worth celebrating by dragging the entire fight back out into the open. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this breakdown, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next time the network reached for the censor button, it would not be over a fish hat, and the consequences would not stop at a title card. A man in Virginia was about to post something on a website that ended with a 25-year federal prison sentence, and Comedy Central was about to erase an entire monologue from television without telling the people who wrote it. Section 4. The Death Threat, Revolution Muslim, and the 200 and 201 Blackout. The 200th episode aired on April 14, 2010, and it was built as a victory lap. Every celebrity the show had ever insulted comes back to Colorado at once, hundreds of them, organized into a class action lawsuit against the town. Tom Cruise leads the group. The offer they make is simple: drop the lawsuit if South Park can produce Muhammad, because the celebrities have worked out that he possesses the one thing they all want, which is the ability to never be made fun of. The premise was the argument stated out loud. The entire reason the character was valuable inside the story was that he had immunity from mockery, and everyone else wanted a piece of it. Building the 200th episode around that idea was a deliberate choice, and it is worth understanding why they made it. A milestone episode is normally an occasion for a victory lap. Shows bring back old characters, reference old jokes, and let long-term viewers feel rewarded for having stayed. This episode does all of that. Hundreds of previously insulted celebrities return. Old plot threads get resurrected. Characters who had not appeared in years show up in crowd scenes. On the surface, it is exactly the celebration the number calls for. Underneath it, the writers used the occasion to reopen the one fight the network had already won. 4 years had passed since Cartoon Wars. The Muhammad question had been settled by everyone quietly agreeing not to raise it again, which is how these things usually end. The show could have marked its 200th episode with any subject on Earth. It chose the subject it had already been beaten on, and structured the entire plot around the exact thing it had been forbidden from doing. The celebrity lawsuit framing is the part that makes the argument work. Every famous person the show ever mocked is furious, has been furious for years, and has never had any way to do anything about it. They have money, lawyers, and public platforms, and none of it has ever produced a single removed episode. Then they discover that one figure has something none of them have, which is genuine protection, and the moment they discover it, they want it more than they want the lawsuit. That is a complete summary of the argument in a single plot device. Protection from mockery is not something anyone earns or deserves. It is a resource, and if it exists, everyone will want it, and the only question is what a person has to be willing to do to get it. Comedy Central had already made its position clear 4 years earlier, so the writers built the episode around that. Muhammad appears, but the network covers him with a large black rectangle with the word censored printed across it. Later, he is put inside a bear costume so that no part of him is visible. The joke was that the show was going through increasingly ridiculous contortions to comply with a rule that everyone knew existed, but nobody would say out loud. The bear costume is what triggered everything that followed. Within days of the episode airing, a post went up on the website of a small New York-based organization called Revolution Muslim. It addressed Parker and Stone directly. It said they would probably wind up like Theo Van Gogh for airing this show. Van Gogh was a Dutch filmmaker who had been murdered on the street in Amsterdam in 2004 after making a short film critical of the treatment of women in some Islamic societies. The post included a photograph of his body. It also included addresses, the location of Comedy Central's offices in New York, and the location of the production company in Los Angeles. The author was a 20-year-old from Virginia named Zachary Adam Chesser, who had been a normal suburban student 2 years earlier, playing football and studying Japanese at a well-regarded high school, and who now went by a different name and spent his time posting extremist material online. When reporters called him, he insisted repeatedly that it was not a threat. He said it was a warning about a likely outcome. He said the addresses were included so people would have the opportunity to protest. He said the photograph of Van Gogh's corpse was there to explain the severity of what Parker and Stone had done. He said all of this to journalists, on the record, from his home, using his real phone. That detail is worth holding on to because it separates this from almost every other threat made against a television television program. Anonymous threats arrive constantly at every network in the world and are handled quietly by security departments without anyone outside ever learning about them. This one came with a name attached, a documented public position, and a willingness to explain the reasoning to reporters on request, which is precisely what made it impossible for the network to file away as background noise. The follow-up episode, 201, was scheduled for the following week. It contained the actual payoff to the whole story, which was a speech about exactly this situation. In the closing scene, Kyle explains the lesson of everything that has happened. The reason Muhammad seems to have the power to avoid mockery is not that he has any power at all. It is that people are afraid, and when people are afraid, they hand over control to whoever is willing to threaten them. The speech was about intimidation and fear, and what happens to a society that rewards them. Jesus and Santa Claus follow up with their own versions of the same point. Comedy Central bleeped the entire thing. Not selected words, not a phrase. Roughly 35 seconds of continuous audio was replaced with an unbroken tone, so that viewers could see three characters standing on screen delivering a monologue and hear nothing at all. Every reference to Muhammad by name across the whole episode was also bleeped, including references that had aired uncensored in previous episodes. The black censored box stayed over the character, and the episode was pulled from the show's own website immediately, so nobody could go look at what had been removed. A significant part of the audience assumed this was a joke. That reaction is worth pausing on, because it says something about how completely the show had trained its own viewers. This is a series that had once put a black title card on screen, announcing its own network censorship. It had built entire episodes around the mechanics of what television will and will not allow. Bleeping a speech about the dangers of censorship in full so that the audience watches three characters silently explain why silence is dangerous is precisely the kind of thing the show would do on purpose. It fits so well that message boards filled up with people praising the choice. Reviewers wrote about how the censorship made the point far more effectively than the speech itself could have. The gag was widely admired as one of the sharpest things the series had ever attempted. None of those people had any way of knowing they were admiring a decision made by network executives who had not consulted the writers. They had not, and they said so immediately. Parker and Stone released a statement clarifying that the bleeps were not some kind of layered joke on their part, that they had written a speech about intimidation and fear, and that the network had removed it without their approval after the threat. They said the audio was never delivered back to them. The version that aired was the only version that existed on television. Only one small detail in the episode could be read as a wink at the situation. During a scene where a giant mechanical Barbra Streisand rampages through town, a voice calls out that a location has been destroyed. The name of that location was the name of Parker and Stone's own production facility. Comedy Central declined to comment on any of it. The reasoning came out years afterward. Doug Herzog, who ran Comedy Central at the time, explained that the decision was about protecting the people who worked in the building and described it as the hardest the network had ever pushed back on anything in the show's history. That is a straightforward answer, and probably an honest one. It also confirms what Kyle's censored speech had said, which is that the deciding factor was fear, and that fear is a lever anyone can pull. The legal consequences for Chesser were severe, and they had almost nothing to do with the cartoon by the time they arrived. He was arrested in New York in July 2010 while attempting to board a plane, despite being on a federal no-fly list. The investigation that followed found that the post about the cartoon was a very small part of what he had been doing. He had twice attempted to travel to Somalia to receive training from the terrorist group Al-Shabaab and had been posting the group's propaganda online in an organized way. He had encouraged people to leave suspicious packages in public places across the United States with the stated purpose of making authorities complacent so that a real explosive device would go unnoticed later. He had also gone much further on the subject of cartoonists. In the weeks after the threat, a campaign had started online in support of Parker and Stone, built around the idea of a day on which large numbers of people would draw Muhammad simultaneously. The logic was that a threat aimed at two men can succeed, while a threat aimed at 50,000 people cannot, because there is nothing to target. The plan never actually came together as a coordinated event, but it received enormous attention while it was being discussed. Chesser encouraged violence against the cartoonists planning to take part, and supplied contact information for them. That escalation is the reason the case ended the way it did. A single post about a television program, however ugly, sits in complicated legal territory involving speech, a sustained pattern of attempting to join a foreign terrorist organization, distributing its material, planning to degrade domestic security response, and distributing the personal details of specific individuals alongside encouragement to attack them does not. In February 2011, a federal judge sentenced him to 25 years in prison. The following year, another operator of the same website, Jesse Curtis Morton, pleaded guilty to conspiracy, communicating threats, and using the internet to intimidate. He had been arrested in Morocco in October and had been in custody since. So the organization behind the the threat effectively ceased to exist. Its two most prominent figures went to federal prison, and the men they threatened continued making the show without interruption for the next 15 years. The episodes themselves did not survive. 201 has never been released in an uncensored form anywhere. It is not on any DVD, not on any Blu-ray, and not on any streaming service. The bleeps are permanent. The only version of that speech that exists in any commercially available format is 35 seconds of tone. Whatever Kyle actually said about intimidation and fear is now known only to the people who wrote it and the handful of people at the network who heard the original audio. The episode became, by a wide margin, one of the most discussed things the show ever produced, and it is discussed almost entirely because of what was taken out of it rather than what was left in. That permanence is the detail that separates this from every other fight in the show's history. The Scientology episode came back after 4 months. The Catholic episode came back and went on to streaming. The film was cut and released. The word episode aired unchanged and got celebrated by its own network years later. In every one of those cases, the restriction was temporary, and the material eventually reached the public in something close to its intended form. This one did not, and the reason it did not is straightforward. Everything else on that list was reversible because the pressure came from people who could be waited out. An advocacy group moves on to the next target. A ratings board issues its verdict and the film opens anyway. A movie star finishes his promotional tour and stops caring. A security assessment does not expire. 15 years on, no company has revisited the decision because there is no upside available to whoever would have to make that call. Restoring 35 seconds of audio to a 14-year-old episode gains a streaming platform almost nothing and exposes it to a risk that cannot be quantified. Every rational actor in that chain arrives at the same answer, permanently, which is how a temporary safety measure becomes the final version of a piece of work. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this breakdown, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 2 episodes had now been effectively destroyed. That should have been the end of the damage. Instead, the blackout started spreading backwards through the show's own history, reaching episodes that had aired without a single complaint years earlier, until 5 separate episodes had been quietly removed from every legal platform on Earth. Section 5. The streaming platforms: Hulu, HBO Max, Paramount Plus, and the 5 missing episodes. There are more than 300 episodes of South Park. 5 of them cannot be watched legally on any streaming platform anywhere on Earth. Not restricted, not age-gated, not hidden behind an extra warning screen. Simply absent in every country, on every service that has ever held the rights, including the services that paid enormous sums of money specifically to have all of it. The list is short, and it is worth reading carefully, because 4 of the 5 had already aired without incident for years before anything happened to them. Super Best Friends from Season 5, Cartoon Wars Part 1 and Cartoon Wars Part 2 from Season 10, 200 and 201 from Season 14. That is the whole blackout. 5 episodes across nearly 3 decades of television, all removed for the same reason, and only 2 of them were ever actually the subject of a threat. The way this happened is the part that gets skipped in most tellings. It was not a single decision made in a single room. It was a slow spread, working backwards through the show's own catalog, taking out episodes that nobody had objected to at the time they aired. Before going through how each one fell, it is worth being precise about what banned means here, because the word gets used loosely, and the reality is more specific. No government ordered these removals. No court issued an injunction. No regulator has ever ruled on them. There is no law anywhere in the United States preventing a streaming service from carrying any of these 5 episodes, and nobody has ever claimed otherwise. Every removal was a business decision, made privately by companies that owned the rights and chose not to exercise them. That is a meaningful distinction, because it means there is no authority anyone could petition to reverse it, and no process available for challenging it. A government ban can be appealed. A corporate risk assessment cannot, because it is not a ruling, it is a preference, and nobody is obliged to justify a preference. Super Best Friends went first, and it is the clearest example of how the logic worked. That episode ran in 2001 with a superhero version of Muhammad standing in a lineup with 7 other religious figures. It aired, it reran, it went out on DVD. For 5 straight years, it existed as an ordinary episode of a cartoon that nobody had a problem with, including the people who would later have enormous problems with the exact same character in the exact same show. Then the Danish cartoon controversy happened in 2005 and 2006, and Comedy Central quietly stopped putting Super Best Friends into the rerun rotation. No announcement went out. The episode just stopped appearing. The content had not changed by a single frame. What changed was the temperature of the room outside the building. Cartoon Wars came next, for reasons that are almost funny when laid out plainly. Those 2 episodes are about censorship. The entire plot is about a network refusing to show an image, and the second part contains a speech arguing that carving out protected categories destroys the whole system. Comedy Central had already censored the image inside the episode when it first aired, replacing it with a black title card explaining what the network had done. So the version of Cartoon Wars that got pulled from streaming was already the censored version. The thing being removed from the internet was a cartoon about the danger of removing cartoons, with the offending part already taken out. Then 200 and 200-01 went, which is the one removal that had an obvious and immediate cause. Those two are also the only two where a person actually went to federal prison over the surrounding events. In their case, the removal happened almost instantly, with 201 disappearing from the show's own official website within days of broadcast. By the time the dust settled, 5 episodes had been erased from legal circulation, and the reason 4 of them were gone had nothing to do with anything anyone had ever said about those 4 episodes. What makes the blackout unusual is how well it has survived every change of ownership. Streaming rights to South Park have moved several times, and each move involved staggering amounts of money. When HBO Max acquired the show, reporting put the value of that arrangement around $500 million for the streaming library. That is an enormous sum for a cartoon, and it bought a nearly complete catalog with a 5-episode hole in it. The hole moved along with the rest of the show. Then the library moved again, over to Paramount Plus, and the same 5 episodes were once more absent on arrival. A new corporate owner, a new platform, a new set of executives, and the identical gap. 3 different companies, across roughly 15 years, each independently arriving at the same conclusion, which is that these 5 are not worth the risk. During that most recent transition, there was a brief panic online, and it produced one of the more instructive small stories in this whole history. A list began circulating claiming that 17 episodes had been banned from the new platform. It looked plausible. It named specific episodes, most of them ones that had caused trouble at some point, and it arrived at exactly the moment when a library transfer made a purge seem believable. The list was not real. Nobody has ever established where it came from. Entertainment outlets picked it up anyway. Several published articles about the 17 banned episodes sourced to the list itself, without waiting for the library to actually go live or asking anyone at the company involved. The story traveled for days on the strength of nothing. When the catalog appeared, the real number was 5, and it was the same 5 it had always been. That sequence matters because it shows how much of the reputation around this show is now self-generating. The series has been censored often enough and dramatically enough that people will believe almost any claim about it being censored again. A list of 17 banned episodes is not obviously ridiculous, because 5 episodes really are banned and everyone knows it. The genuine history creates a permanent supply of credible fake history. There is a second wrinkle underneath the transition that was real, and it confused a lot of people at the same time. Viewers in the United Kingdom and Ireland found that their versions of the new service were missing far more than 5 episodes. The number floated at the time was around 15. That gap had nothing to do with censorship, threats, or content. It was rights and licensing, which vary by territory and often lag behind a platform launch by months. But it landed in the middle of the fake list story, and the two got tangled together immediately, because a viewer staring at 15 missing episodes has no way of telling a legal blackout from a paperwork delay. There is a second layer of restriction that is easy to miss, and it is stranger than the streaming ban. 4 of the 5 episodes are available on physical media. Super Best Friends is on the Season 5 discs in full. Cartoon Wars Part 1 and Part 2 are on the Season 10 discs. All 3 of those exist in a form a person can buy, own, and watch whenever they like. 200A1 is different. The disc version is not uncensored. What sits on the Season 14 release is the broadcast version, with the black box, the bleeped name, and the 35 seconds of unbroken tone where the closing speech is supposed to be. The original audio was never released in any format. It is not on the DVD, not on the Blu-ray, and not in any special edition anywhere in the world. That means the uncensored version of that speech has never been commercially available to a single member of the public, in any country, on any medium, at any point since it was written. Whatever the actual words were, they exist now only in the memories of the people who wrote them, and the small number of network employees who heard the original cut before it was replaced. Every version accessible to any viewer contains a hole where the argument used to be. The international picture adds another layer on top of all this. The blackout in the United States concerns 5 episodes. Outside the United States, the reach has occasionally been much wider. Sri Lanka banned the entire series outright following the 200 and 200-01 controversy, on the grounds that the show's treatment of religious figures was offensive. Not 5 episodes. The whole show, every season, gone. Regional libraries have their own quirks as well, and during the most recent platform transition, viewers in the United Kingdom and Ireland found that their local versions of the service were missing far more than 5 episodes, for reasons connected to rights and licensing rather than to any specific controversy. What all of this adds up to is a rare situation in modern television. Enormous companies with enormous legal departments have looked at 5 specific episodes of an highly profitable show repeatedly over more than a decade, and each time decided that the safest thing to do is pretend they do not exist. The comparison that makes the logic logic clearest involves an episode that is not on the list. South Park has produced plenty of material far uglier than anything in those 5 episodes. There are episodes built around graphic sexual material. There are episodes constructed around real people convicted of serious crimes, aired while those cases were still fresh in public memory. There are episodes about recently deceased celebrities that went out within weeks of the death. There are episodes that generated genuine, widespread, sustained anger from large numbers of people who had every reason to be angry. None of them were removed. All of them remain available, in full, on every platform that carries the show, in every territory. Set the 5 banned episodes next to that catalog, and the pattern becomes impossible to miss. The removed episodes are not the cruelest ones. They are not the most graphic ones. Several of them are, by the standards of this series, tame. Super Best Friends is a superhero team-up. Cartoon Wars is mostly an argument about another cartoon's writing process. What separates them from everything else is not content at all. The line being drawn is not about how offensive something is. It is about whether anyone credibly threatened violence over it. Ordinary outrage, however loud and however sustained, has never cost this show a single episode. A death threat cost it 5. Parker and Stone have been consistent about what they think this proves, and it is the same thing Kyle was saying in the speech that got erased. When the only material that disappears is the material somebody threatened over, the effective rule for what can be said on television is written by whoever is willing to threaten. Everyone else can complain forever, and nothing happens. The result is a permanent monument to that argument, sitting inside the show's own catalog. 5 missing entries, 4 of them missing because of something that happened to 2 other episodes, one of them missing its own conclusion in every version that has ever been sold. The practical effect of all this has been close to 0, which is the last thing worth noting about it. Anyone who wants to watch those 5 episodes can watch them. The physical discs are widely available and inexpensive. The box sets sit on shelves in ordinary shops, and 4 of the 5 exist on those discs in complete form. A person with mild curiosity and $20 has no obstacle at all. Beyond that, the episodes circulate constantly and informally, in the way that anything designated as forbidden always circulates. Clips appear, uploads appear and disappear and reappear. Discussion threads reconstruct the plots in detail for people who have never seen them. The Blackout has succeeded in removing the episodes from official platforms, and has failed entirely at removing them from culture. What it has accomplished is turning 5 ordinary episodes into the most sought-after material the show has ever produced. There are viewers who have never watched a full season who can name all 5. There are people who first heard of this series because of the ban rather than the show, which means the final tally on the most successful censorship campaign in the show's history is that it made 5 episodes famous, made one speech legendary without anyone hearing it, and prevented nobody from watching anything. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this breakdown, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Religion had been the trigger every time up to this point. Long before any of it started, a much stranger campaign was already underway, aimed at a single word, not a religious word, not a slur, one ordinary syllable that broadcasters had spent 50 years treating as unspeakable, and that South Park was about to say 162 times in a row. Section 6. The Broadcast Watchdog, the Parents' Television Council, and it hits the fan. For most of the history of American television, a small number of words were simply not available. Networks did not debate them. They did not run them past legal. There was a list. Everyone in the industry knew what was on it, and the list did not change. By the late 1990s, that arrangement had started to crack in ways that made no sense to anybody watching. The clearest example was a police drama that had spent years negotiating with its own network over language, eventually arriving at an arrangement where a small number of otherwise forbidden words could appear a limited number of times per episode, not freely, not at the writer's discretion. A quota, agreed in advance, counted and enforced. That is a strange thing to exist. Somewhere in an office, people had sat down and decided that a specific word was acceptable twice, but not 4 times, and that this distinction was meaningful enough to write down. Then a hospital drama on network television used one of those words uncensored in a single scene, and the entire industry treated it as a milestone. Newspapers ran stories about it in advance. Viewers tuned in specifically to hear it happen. One utterance of one ordinary word on one evening became a genuine news event covered by the national press. The show that had used it got a rating spike out of the attention, which meant the lesson the industry actually learned was that breaking the rule was commercially rewarding, provided it happened exactly once and everybody knew about it beforehand. That is the specific hypocrisy Parker and Stone went after. A word could not be said because it was harmful, except it could be said if a network negotiated hard enough, and when it happened, the network would advertise it. The rule was not a rule. It was a scarcity arrangement, and the value came from the scarcity rather than from any harm being prevented. There was a second layer of nonsense sitting on top of it. Broadcast television operates under federal rules about indecent content. Cable does not. So the same word, spoken by the same actor, was a regulatory matter on one channel and purely a business decision on another, and viewers flipping between the two had no way of knowing which set of invisible rules applied to whatever they were currently watching. That was the situation Parker and Stone decided to walk into. The Season 5 premiere aired on June 20th, 2001, and it was called It Hits the Fan. The plot begins with a fictional crime drama announcing that it will broadcast a certain word uncensored during an upcoming episode. The entire country becomes obsessed. Everyone in South Park gathers around their televisions for the big moment. The word gets said, nothing bad happens, and within hours the whole town is using it constantly in every sentence about everything. Then people start dying. The show's explanation is that the word is an actual curse in the older sense, a magical seal holding back a plague, and that every use of it weakens the barrier a little more. A knight arrives to explain that the ancient order responsible for guarding these words has been overwhelmed. Standards and practices departments, in the world of the episode, are not corporate cowards. They are the last line of defense against a literal dragon. That is the joke sitting under the whole thing. The people enforcing the rules believe with total sincerity that they are protecting civilization, and everyone else in the town thinks they are ridiculous. And the episode simply plays out what happens when the second group wins the argument by sheer weight of numbers. There is a second joke running alongside it that is sharper than the first. Cartman, who has spent the entire episode delighted by the new freedom, becomes miserable partway through. The reason is not guilt, it is that the word has stopped working. When everyone says it constantly, saying it accomplishes nothing, and Cartman's whole personality depends on being able to provoke a reaction. So he goes looking for a replacement and settles on the name of a Thai appetizer, which he insists is far more disgusting than the word everyone else is using, and which he then deploys with enormous satisfaction because nobody has built up any resistance to it. That subplot is the actual thesis. A word is only powerful because people have agreed it is powerful. Remove the agreement and the word is just a noise, which means the people guarding the list are not protecting anyone from harm, they are maintaining the exact conditions that make the words harmful in the first place. The knights are drawn to underline it. They are not corporate lawyers or nervous executives. They are armored warriors from an ancient order with a sacred text listing the forbidden words, and they treat their job with total seriousness and total sincerity. The episode never portrays them as villains. It portrays them as people doing a real job for reasons that made sense a very long time ago and stopped making sense without anyone noticing. Making the censors sincere rather than corrupt is a choice most satire would not make, and it is why the episode holds up nearly 25 years later. It is much harder to argue with a portrait of someone who believes they are helping than with a portrait of someone cynical, because the second one lets the audience off the hook and the first one does not. In the process, the word is used 162 times. There is a counter in the corner of the screen tracking every single instance, which means the episode is not merely breaking the rule but keeping score while it does, including the theme song. The word lands roughly once every 8 seconds for the entire running time. By the halfway point, the shock is completely gone, which is the actual argument the episode is making. A word that gets said 200 times in 20 minutes stops being a weapon and becomes noise, and the counter exists specifically so that viewers can watch that happen in real time rather than being told about it afterward. Nobody in the episode ever explains the point. The number in the corner does the explaining. The part almost nobody knows is what happened between the writers and their own network. The original plan was modest. Parker and Stone wanted to use the word a handful of times, in the way a drama might, to make a point about the arbitrary nature of the limit. Comedy Central said no. A few uses was a step too far, and the network was not prepared to authorize it, so the pitch changed. Instead of a few times, they proposed saying it something like 200 times. Comedy Central approved that. The reasoning behind that flip is not as strange as it sounds. A handful of uses reads as a network quietly loosening its standards, which invites the question of where the new line is and who moved it. 200 uses is unmistakably a joke about the concept of standards, which is a different thing entirely and much easier to defend. The absurdity of the number was what made it safe. That detail is the most useful thing in this entire story because it shows the actual mechanics of what these fights are about. The network was never really worried about the word. It was worried about being seen to have made a decision about the word. Turning the whole thing into an obvious gag removed the decision from the equation. The outrage arrived exactly where everyone expected it to. The Parents Television Council had been the show's most persistent institutional critic for years by this point. The organization existed specifically to catalog objectionable content on television and pressure advertisers about it, and South Park had been near the top of its list from close to the beginning. Its founder had built a public profile around exactly this kind of campaign. The council condemned the episode as a clear example of the show promoting indecency for its own sake, arguing that the commentary framing was a cover for simply enjoying the vulgarity. Years later, in a report on basic cable content, the organization was still using an excerpt from this episode episode as evidence. That accusation is more interesting than most criticism of this show, because it is not obviously wrong. The argument the episode makes about the arbitrariness of language rules is real and well constructed. It is also true that Parker and Stone found the whole thing hugely funny and enjoyed doing it, and neither of them has ever pretended otherwise. Both things are true at once. The commentary is genuine, and the delight in the vulgarity is genuine, and the episode does not particularly separate them. Where the criticism collapses is in what it proposes doing about that. The organization's method was to catalog offensive content, publicize it, and pressure the companies buying advertising around it. That method depends entirely on advertisers caring, and advertisers on late-night cable in 2001 were buying access to adults who had specifically chosen to watch this program. There was no pressure point available. It also required convincing the public that a cable channel showing adult content at night to a self-selected audience was a problem requiring intervention, which is a much harder sell than the same argument about broadcast television during daytime hours. Cable is something a household chooses to pay for. The campaign was aimed at a target that had no obligation to respond and no incentive to, using a lever that was not connected to anything. Complaints went to the network in volume. In a conversation with the head of Comedy Central at the time, the figure mentioned was roughly 5,000 emails from a parents and teachers organization objecting to the broadcast. 5,000 emails sounds like a serious number until it is placed against the audience, which was somewhere in the range of 2 to 3 million people for that episode. The complaints represented a fraction of a percent of the people who watched, and a rounding error against the show's total viewership across the week. Nothing came of it. No advertiser left. No fine was issued, because the rules the council was invoking apply to broadcast television, and this was cable. The episode aired again. It went on to DVD in 2005 with the rest of season 5, and has been available continuously ever since. What the campaign did accomplish was making the episode far more famous than a season premiere would ordinarily be. Within a few years, it was showing up on retrospective lists. Television critics ranked it among the most unexpected moments in the medium's history. Comedy Central itself later built a marathon around 10 episodes it claimed had changed the world, and put this one on the list at number 8, which is a network celebrating the exact broadcast that had generated 5,000 complaint emails to its own inbox. The genuine legacy is harder to see because it happened gradually, and it happened everywhere. Basic cable in 2001 was careful about language. Basic cable a decade later was not. The shows that made cable dramas famous in the years that followed did not treat that word as a special event requiring negotiation, and nobody wrote newspaper articles in advance about individual uses of it. The taboo did not get formally repealed. It simply stopped being enforced because one show had demonstrated in public that the sky does not fall. No rule changed on paper. Decisions about language on cable have always belonged to individual networks rather than to any regulator, and no regulator issued any new guidance because of this episode. What changed was the assumption underneath the decisions. The show has never let the subject go either. Decades later, it was still building material around the people who regulate broadcast content, which is roughly the same target it was aiming at in 2001, with the same basic argument attached. Somebody sitting in an office deciding which sounds citizens are permitted to hear is going to look ridiculous eventually, no matter how serious the office looks at the time. The campaign against It Hits the Fan is probably the purest example in this entire story of an attempt to cancel something producing the opposite of its intended result. An organization dedicated to reducing profanity on television spent years drawing attention to the single most profane episode ever broadcast, and the episode ended up on curated lists of television's most important moments, partly because of the attention. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this breakdown, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A television network with the freedom to make its own calls sat behind every fight up to now. 2 years before that episode aired, Parker and Stone had walked into a very different kind of room, one where a small panel of people nobody can name held total power over whether anyone under 17 would ever be allowed to buy a ticket. That fight started with the title, Section 7, the ratings board, the mpa and bigger, longer, and uncut. In 1999, South Park was 2 years old, and the biggest thing on cable, and the obvious next move was a film. What made the project unusual is that Parker and Stone decided the film should be about censorship, which meant they were about to spend a year negotiating with a censorship body over a movie criticizing censorship bodies. The plot they built is straightforward and vicious. The boys sneak into an R-rated movie starring 2 Canadian comedians whose entire act is crude noises and worse language. They come out repeating everything they heard. Their parents, rather than examining anything about their own households, organize against the film, then against the performers, then against Canada itself. Within an hour of screen time, the United States is at war with a neighboring country. People are dying, and the original complaint has been forgotten entirely by everyone still fighting about it. The argument underneath is that outrage about entertainment is almost never really about entertainment. It is about adults finding a target outside the house, so they never have to look inside it. The first obstacle arrived before a single frame of the film was rated. The original title was South Park, All Hell Breaks Loose. It is a plain expression, it fits the plot precisely, and it contains one mildly religious word that appears in ordinary conversation constantly. The board rejected it. The reasoning given was that the word could not appear in the title because the film was animated. That reasoning is worth sitting with because it contains the entire problem in one sentence. The content of the film was not the issue. The format was. An animated feature was assumed to be for children regardless of what was actually in it, and therefore had to carry a title that would not alarm a parent scanning a listings page, no matter how far the actual movie sat from anything a child should watch. The same film, shot in live action with the same script, would almost certainly have kept its title without anyone raising a question, which means the objection was never really about the word at all. Parker and Stone were annoyed and responded the way they usually do, which is by proposing something worse and waiting to see if anyone notices. The replacement title was South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut. All three of those words describe the film accurately in a boring way. A feature is bigger than an episode. It runs longer. It is uncut in the sense of being unedited for television. Read plainly, it is a completely innocent description of a movie. Read the other way, it is a joke about male anatomy, delivered on every poster, in every newspaper listing, on the front of every video box, for the rest of time. The board approved it. The submitted title was cleaner than the rejected one, only in the sense that its obscenity required a half-second of thought. Nobody caught it until it was far too late to do anything, at which point the title was printed on marketing materials across the world. That single exchange demonstrates something the film itself spends 90 minutes arguing. Rules about offensive content tend to police surface features rather than meaning, because surface features are the only thing a committee can consistently identify. A word on a list gets caught. A dirty joke wearing a clean word walks straight through. The restrictions did not stop at the title. The board also required that all promotional material be suitable for general audiences, which meant an obscene film had to advertise itself using imagery a small child could look at without concern. The movie was permitted to be what it was, as long as nothing about its public presentation admitted it. Then came the rating itself, and that fight was long. The film was submitted, rejected, cut, and resubmitted repeatedly. Each pass came back with objections. Changes were made, and the process began again. Parker and Stone had publicly said they would accept the harsher rating rather than compromise the film, and for a while they held that position. At the last stage, with the release approaching, they gave in and made the cuts required for the more commercially viable rating. The reasons were straightforward. Theater chains treat the harsher rating as effectively unreleasable. Many newspapers historically refused advertising for such films, and a studio with a marketing campaign already running does not have the appetite for a fight over principle. A film nobody can see in a theater is not a statement, it is a loss. Matt Stone talked about this experience in detail years afterward, and the point he kept returning to had nothing to do with prudishness. It was about consistency. He had made an independent film before South Park called Orgasmo, and that film received the harshest rating available, with almost no discussion and no meaningful route to appeal. Now he was back in the same building with a major studio behind him and a large marketing budget, and the process worked completely differently. There were conversations, there were specific notes, there was negotiation and back and forth until a workable answer emerged. The content had not become less objectionable in the years between the two films. The difference was who was standing behind it. A small independent production got a verdict. A studio production got a process. That is the criticism that has followed the rating system for decades, and it comes from filmmakers across every genre and every political position. The complaint is rarely that a rating was too harsh in a single case. It is that identical material seems to receive different treatment depending on the resources of the people submitting it, while the board itself operates with almost no public accountability and its members are not publicly identified. Several features of the arrangement make that difficult to argue about productively. The system is voluntary, which means it is not a government body and is not bound by the rules that constrain government bodies. No filmmaker is legally required to submit anything. In practice, almost every filmmaker submits because the major theater chains will not book an unrated film and most large advertising outlets will not carry one, which makes the voluntary system functionally mandatory for anyone who wants a normal release. The board's reasoning is also not published in any detailed form. A film comes back with a rating and some indication of what caused it, and the filmmaker is left to work out which specific elements to remove through trial and error. That process favors anyone who can afford to submit repeatedly. Appeals exist, but the appeals process has its own limits, and a small production without a studio behind it generally does not have the time or money to use it well. None of that means the board acts in bad faith. It means the structure produces uneven outcomes and provides very little information about why, and the people most affected are the ones with the fewest resources to push back. The outcome of the whole fight is the part that makes the effort part look most pointless. The film opened in June 1999 and became a substantial hit. The critical response was warmer than anyone expected for a crude cartoon about a war with Canada, and the reason is that reviewers noticed what the film actually is underneath the language. It is a musical, built properly, with genuine structure. The songs are not parodies of musical numbers. They are musical numbers, arranged and orchestrated seriously, doing the work songs are supposed to do in that form, which is advancing plot and revealing character. The vulgarity sits on top of a piece of craftsmanship that took real effort. That combination is what made the ratings fight so awkward for everyone involved. The board was evaluating a film on the basis of specific countable elements, because that is what the process measures. Words, images, actions. What it has no mechanism for measuring is whether any of it is in service of something, and this particular film was in service of an argument about the exact process being applied to it. Nothing in it had been meaningfully softened by the time it reached theaters. Every argument the movie makes about censorship survived intact into the final cut, and the film's central joke is that the parents crusading against vulgar entertainment are more dangerous than the entertainment ever was. The character who states that most directly is a child, explaining calmly that his mother would rather rebuild an entire country's foreign policy than examine anything happening inside her own house. The film gives that speech to a third grader because an adult delivering it would sound like a lecture. Then it went further than anyone involved could have predicted. One of the songs from the film received an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Song. That song is a musical number in which a group of parents blame a foreign country for their own children's behavior, sung by characters who go on to start a war over it. The number was performed live at the ceremony, in front of the entire film industry, on network television, and the circumstances of that performance are almost too neat to be real. The song contains language that could not be broadcast, so the lyrics had to be altered for the ceremony. A song about censorship from a film that had fought a ratings board for a year, nominated for the industry's highest honor, was itself censored in order to be performed at the event honoring it. Nobody planned that. It simply happened because the rules that the film spent 90 minutes attacking were still in force at the ceremony celebrating the film. The performance also put the whole thing in front of an audience that had nothing to do with the show. Millions of people who had never watched a single episode and would never watch one sat through a musical number in which cartoon parents blame a neighboring country for their own failures. Many of them had no idea what they were looking at. The joke was aimed squarely at them anyway. It did not win. That is almost beside the point. A film that had been rejected repeatedly, forced to change its title, forced to cut, and forced to advertise itself as though it were suitable for children, ended the year competing for an Academy Award and performing on the same stage as everything else nominated that season. The sequence there is worth tracing all the way through. A ratings board rejected the film's title on the grounds that animation implies children. The replacement title was a significantly filthier joke that the board did not catch. The film was rejected repeatedly and eventually cut. Every promotional image had to be suitable for a general audience, and the finished product, unchanged in argument and barely changed in content, ended up nominated for one of the most prestigious awards in the world, with its most sarcastic song about censorship performed on a broadcast watched by tens of millions of people. The board got a title change and some trims. The film got an Oscar nomination and a permanent place in the argument about how ratings actually work. There is a coda to this that took several years to arrive and made the whole episode far more pointed. Matt Stone went on to appear in a documentary about the rating system, laying out the difference between how his independent film had been handled and how his studio film had been handled, in detail, on camera. The film that documentary became was itself submitted to the same board, and it received the harshest rating available, in part because of the material it contained about the board. That documentary was of course then subject to exactly the process it was documenting, which meant its own rating became part of the evidence for its argument. The same trap the show had built into Cartoon Wars, where the act of censoring proves the point about censoring, had appeared again in a wholly different medium without anyone needing to design it. None of it changed anything structurally. The system operates today essentially the way it operated in 1999. Films are still submitted, still rejected, still cut, and still resubmitted. The membership is still not public. What did change was the volume of the conversation about it. Before this period, ratings disputes were an industry matter discussed mostly by people inside the industry. Afterward, they were a subject ordinary audiences had opinions about, partly because a cartoon had made the argument in a form that several million people found funny enough to sit through. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this breakdown, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. An organization with a name, a process, and something to lose had been behind all of it until now. The next wave came from nobody in particular, which is what made it impossible to answer. It arrived through school offices, in letters to parents, and in a rule about what children were allowed to wear on their own chests. Section 8, the schools, dress codes, merchandise bans, and the letters home. The strangest campaign against this show was not run by an organization. It had no president, no press releases, no mailing list, and no coordinated strategy. It happened in thousands of separate buildings at roughly the same time, carried out by people who had never spoken to each other, and it targeted something no network executive could remove and no lawyer could argue about. It targeted clothing. To understand how that happened, it helps to look at what South Park actually was in 1997 and 1998, because the version of the show that exists in most people's memory is not the version that caused the panic. The show premiered in August 1997 and became the biggest thing on Comedy Central almost immediately. It was not a modest cult hit that grew slowly. It arrived and detonated. Within months, the catchphrases were everywhere. The characters were on magazine covers, and a cable channel that most Americans could not have named the year before was suddenly a household word. The network had been a minor operation with a small audience and limited reach. One program changed its position in the industry permanently. Part of what drove that speed was how the show had reached people before it ever aired. Parker and Stone had made a short animated film a couple of years earlier as a video greeting card commission, and copies of it had spread across early internet connections at a time when passing video around online was slow, difficult, and unusual. By the time the series launched, a substantial number of people already knew the characters and had been waiting. That is an early example of something that would become normal 2 decades later, which is an audience arriving before the product does. It also meant the initial viewership skewed toward people who had gone looking for it, which is the opposite of how television audiences usually assemble. The merchandising followed instantly and hugely, and the scale of it is easy to underestimate now. The merchandising followed instantly and hugely. Shirts, posters, keychains, mugs, plush toys, and every other object a licensing department could think of. The characters are 4 small round children drawn in a deliberately crude construction paper style, with big eyes and simple shapes, and they translate onto a shirt beautifully. They look, in still form, exactly like characters from a children's program. That is the entire mechanism of what happened next. The show aired late at night. It carried the most restrictive rating available for television. Its content included graphic language, violence, and jokes that would be considered aggressive on any adult program. None of that is visible on a t-shirt. What is visible is a cartoon child with a round face, often accompanied by a catchphrase that a person unfamiliar with the show would read as harmless nonsense. So the shirts went into schools, worn by children who in many cases were much younger than the audience the show was made for, and teachers started noticing. The mismatch was total. A teacher looking at a 9-year-old wearing a round cartoon face had no way of knowing whether that child had watched a single episode or had simply been bought a shirt by an aunt who thought it was cute. Both were common. The garment carried no information about what anyone had actually seen, which meant every enforcement decision was being made on the basis of a guess about a household nobody in the building had visited. The response was not centralized, and it was not consistent. In some buildings, students were asked to turn their shirts inside out for the day. In others, the clothing was banned outright under existing dress code policies. Some administrators went further and sent letters home to parents, warning them about the program their children were apparently watching, on the theory that the parents did not know. That last step is the one that reveals what the whole thing was really about. A school telling parents what their children watch at home is not a dress code enforcement action. It is an intervention. The shirts were not the problem. The shirts were evidence of a problem, and the evidence happened to be the only part of it a school had any authority over. There was pushback almost immediately, and it came from a direction the administrators had not fully thought through. Clothing worn by students in American public schools sits inside a long and well-developed area of law regarding expression, and it is far more contested than most administrators assume when they write a policy. The general shape of it is that schools have real authority to restrict what students wear, but that authority is tied to specific justifications. Clothing that disrupts the operation of the school can be restricted. Clothing that is obscene can be restricted. Clothing that promotes illegal activity can be restricted. Broad and neutral dress codes covering things like coverage, footwear, and slogans are generally uncontroversial. Where it gets difficult is a rule that names one television program. A shirt with a round cartoon face on it does not disrupt anything by itself. It is not obscene in any legal sense, because a cartoon character is not obscene. And a rule that singles out one show because adults object to that show's content is, functionally, a rule about the content rather than about the garment, which puts it on considerably shakier ground than a rule about hemline. There was an additional problem that made these policies awkward to defend, even when nobody threatened to challenge them. The bans were rarely consistent. A school that prohibited one animated program's merchandise while permitting merchandise from other adult-oriented shows or from films with similar ratings was making a distinction it could not really explain. In many buildings, the enforcement came down to whichever character a particular teacher happened to recognize, which is not a policy at all. Plenty of administrators recognized all of this and quietly backed away rather than invite the argument. argument. Others held their position and were never challenged, which is the outcome in the overwhelming majority of cases, because contesting a dress code decision requires a family with the time, money, and appetite to do it. Plenty of administrators recognized this and backed away rather than invite the argument. Others held their position. There was no national ruling and no single case that settled the question, which is precisely why the campaign was so difficult to respond to. There was nothing to respond to. It was thousands of small decisions made independently, each one too minor to fight, and collectively adding up to a genuine cultural verdict. None of it made the smallest dent in the show. The audience the school bans were protecting was not the audience Comedy Central was selling to. Advertisers were buying access to adults watching late at night, and no advertiser has ever pulled out of a program because middle schoolers were told to change their shirts. The merchandise kept selling, and in some cases the ban functioned as advertising, since telling a 12-year-old that an item of clothing is forbidden is an unusually effective way to make that item desirable. The show's response to all of this was to put the panic directly into the program and let it run. This had started before the merchandise wave even peaked. In the first season, an episode called Death runs two stories side by side, and the pairing is the whole point. In one, Stan's grandfather is very old, in constant pain, and repeatedly asking his grandson to help him die. It is an uncomfortable storyline about a real and difficult subject, handled with more seriousness than the show is usually credited with. In the other, the parents of South Park discover that their children watch a cartoon featuring two Canadians whose entire act consists of crude noises. They organize. They travel to the network headquarters. They protest outside the building. When the network does not respond, they escalate, and the escalation continues past every reasonable stopping point until people are at risk over a cartoon. While all of this is happening, not one of those parents notices that their children are dealing with an actual moral crisis about the end of a family member's life, entirely unsupervised, because every adult in town is busy standing outside a television studio. That episode aired in September 1997, roughly a month after the series premiered. So before the merchandise had fully saturated the market, before the school bans started, before any organization had issued a statement about the show had already produced a complete portrait of the reaction it was about to receive, including the specific detail of adults becoming so absorbed in protesting entertainment that they miss what is actually happening to the children they are protesting on behalf of. Every warning letter sent home to a parent over the following 2 years was, in effect, an unpaid endorsement of that episode. Then the film built an entire war out of it. The plot of the 1999 movie is parents blaming a cartoon for their children's behavior, forming an organization, and driving a country into armed conflict, while every child in the story understands perfectly well that the adults are the dangerous ones. The song from that film nominated for an Academy Award is a musical number about parents refusing to take responsibility for anything. That is a fairly unusual position for a show to be in. The moral panic aimed at it had already been written into it in advance as a joke, and every new letter sent home to a parent made the joke land harder. The most durable thing about this whole episode is that it never really ended. Bans on media-related clothing in schools did not stop when the initial wave of attention faded. Similar rules have continued to appear for decades, covering other adult animated programs as well, with the same basic logic each time. Students get asked to turn shirts inside out. Policies get written that name specific shows. The reasoning is always that a cartoon on clothing sends the wrong signal about what a school considers acceptable. South Park has remained near the top of those lists the entire time, which means the show has now been treated as inappropriate schoolwear across 3 separate generations of students, including students whose parents were the ones being sent warning letters in the first place. There is something almost touching about that persistence, and something completely absurd about it. The absurdity is the mismatch in scale. In 1998, restricting a shirt was a meaningful intervention, because a shirt was one of a small number of ways a child could carry a piece of culture into a building. Television was scheduled. Recordings were physical objects. A school could reduce a child's exposure to something by controlling what came through the door. None of that is true anymore. Every student in the building has instant access to every episode ever produced on a device in their pocket at any moment. The show is on streaming services, on clip channels, in short-form video, and in memes that circulate constantly among people who have never watched a full episode of anything. A rule about shirts in that environment is not a restriction. It is a gesture. The touching part is that the gesture keeps getting made anyway, which suggests it was never really about limiting exposure at all. It was about a school stating a position on what it endorses, which is a legitimate thing for an institution to want to do, and which has essentially nothing to do with whether any child watches anything. What that longevity actually demonstrates is how little any of it accomplished. Nearly 30 years of scattered clothing restrictions, and the show is still running, still merchandised, still hugely profitable, and still available on every device those students carry in their pockets. The rule reaches a shirt for 6 hours a day, it does not reach anything else. There is one more detail that puts the entire campaign in perspective. Every other fight in this story involves someone trying to remove the show, or an episode, or a scene from circulation. Whether they succeeded or failed, the target was the work itself. The clothing bans were the only campaign in the show's history where nobody made any attempt to affect the show at all. Nobody wrote to Comedy Central. Nobody organized against advertisers. Nobody demanded an episode be pulled. They simply decided that children should not be seen displaying it, which is an admission that the show itself was already beyond reach, and that the only remaining option was to police the evidence of it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this breakdown, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A lost lawsuit or a bad news cycle had been the worst available outcome in every case so far. In October 2019, the show made a joke about a foreign government, and that government did something no advocacy group, network, or ratings board had ever managed. It made the entire series disappear for 1/5 of the planet overnight. Section 9, The Foreign Government, China and Banned in China. On October 2nd, 2019, an episode called Banned in China went out, and it did two things at once that most shows would not attempt separately. The first storyline follows Randy Marsh, who has been running a marijuana business, traveling to China to expand into an enormous new market. He gets caught with product at customs and is sent to a work camp. Inside the camp, he finds a familiar cast of prisoners, including a bear who has been locked up for looking too much like somebody important. That bear is not a random joke, and the story behind it is one of the odder things to happen in modern politics. Several years earlier, internet users had begun circulating side-by-side images comparing photographs of the Chinese leader with illustrations of Winnie the Pooh. The comparisons were not political arguments. They were visual jokes about posture and shape, of the kind that circulate about every public figure in every country constantly, and they spread because they were mildly funny rather than because they carried any message. The response was to restrict the character. Searches for the bear's name began returning nothing on major platforms. Images were removed. The pattern was inconsistent and difficult to document precisely, which is normal for this kind of enforcement, but the general effect was clear enough that the comparison itself became far more widely known than it had ever been while it was merely a joke. Then in 2018, a live-action film built entirely around the character did not receive a release in the country. The reasons were never stated officially, and there are only a limited number of foreign films permitted each year regardless, so the absence could technically be explained several ways. Almost nobody explained it several ways. So by 2019, a soft toy from an English children's book had become a sensitive political symbol in the world's most populous country, purely because somebody had tried to stop people from making a joke about it. Putting that specific bear in a labor camp inside the episode was a direct reference to all of it, compressed into about 4 seconds of screen time, and it worked because the audience already knew the whole story. The second storyline follows Stan, Kenny, Butters, and Jimmy starting a heavy metal band. A manager arrives and explains the business reality to them. If they want their music to reach the biggest audience on earth, every creative decision has to be run past Chinese censors first, and anything those censors dislike has to go. The boys watch their own work get sanded down piece by piece until nothing recognizable is left. Stan eventually refuses, saying he cannot sell his soul this way, and that living in a world where China controls his country's art is not worth it. The target of that half of the episode was not really China, it was Hollywood. The argument being made is that American studios had been quietly rewriting their own films for years to keep access to a market of over 1 billion people, removing scenes, changing villains, and adjusting plots to avoid problems, while telling audiences at home nothing about it. The censorship was being performed voluntarily, in advance, by American companies, on American films, before anyone in Beijing had to ask. The timing of the episode turned out to be extraordinary, and it was almost entirely luck. Censorship, the general manager of the Houston Rockets, posted a short message supporting pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. He deleted it quickly. It did not matter. Chinese broadcasters dropped NBA coverage, sponsors pulled back, and the league found itself issuing statements attempting to calm the situation while being accused at home of abandoning its principles for money. So the exact scenario the episode had built its plot around was playing out in real life, involving one of the largest sports organizations in the world, in the same 7-day window. The league's position was difficult, and going through it explains why the episode landed as hard as it did. Basketball had spent decades building an audience in China, and by 2019 that audience was enormous. Games were broadcast to hundreds of millions of people, merchandise sold at scale, players ran promotional tours, sponsorship arrangements with Chinese companies were worth very large sums. The market was not a bonus on top of the league's business. It had become a substantial part of it. One deleted message from one executive threatened the whole arrangement, and the league's response satisfied nobody. Statements were issued attempting to acknowledge the offense caused without formally disowning the executive's right to to have said anything. In China, those statements were read as insufficient. In the United States, they were read as an apology for supporting democracy protesters, and the criticism came from politicians and commentators across the entire political spectrum, which almost nothing does. The parallel to Hollywood was exact, and it had been running much longer and much more quietly. Studios had been making changes to films for years to preserve access. Scenes got trimmed, villains got reassigned to different nationalities, maps and flags got adjusted, dialogue got rewritten. Some of these changes appeared only in the version released in China. Others were made to the film everyone in the world watched, because maintaining two versions is expensive and it is simpler to build one that will pass everywhere. Almost none of it was disclosed to audiences. A viewer in a theater in Ohio had no way of knowing whether a scene had been shaped by a director's judgment or by a set of guidelines from a foreign regulator, because nobody involved had any commercial reason to explain the difference. That is the practice the episode put on screen using 4 children and a metal band, and the reason it worked is that everybody in the industry already knew, and nobody in the industry would say it. The response from China was total, and it was fast. South Park did not get restricted, age-gated, or edited. It was removed. Episodes vanished from streaming platforms including Yoku and iQIYI. Searching for the show on Baidu Tieba, a major discussion forum, returned a notice that the section was temporarily closed in accordance with relevant law and regulation. Douban, a large ratings and reviews site, returned nothing. Weibo, the biggest social platform in the country, had no mentions of the show remaining. Fan pages disappeared. Discussion threads disappeared. Reporters checking the streaming services found something particularly strange. Some listings for the show were still visible, but selecting an episode produced nothing. The catalog entry existed. The content behind it did not. Roughly 3 decades of a television program, along with every conversation about it, erased from the internet of the world's most populous country in a matter of days. That is a scale of removal nothing else in this story comes close to. The Catholic League got 1 marathon slot. The ratings board got a title change. Comedy Central got 5 episodes. A government got everything everywhere all at once. The response from Parker and Stone came on October 7th, and it is probably the single most quoted thing they have ever written. They released a short statement, formally titled as an official apology to China. In it, they said that, like the NBA, they welcomed the Chinese censors into their homes and into their hearts. They said they too loved money more than freedom and democracy. They stated that the Chinese leader did not look like Winnie the Pooh at all. They promoted their upcoming 300th episode. They wished long life to the Communist Party of China, hoped that the autumn sorghum harvest would be bountiful, and closed by asking whether things were good now. Every line in it is doing a job. The NBA reference ties the show's situation directly to the sports story dominating the news that week and puts the league on the wrong side of the comparison. The line about loving money more than freedom is aimed at every studio quietly editing its own films. The denial about the bear repeats the exact comparison that got the character restricted in the first place, and the promotional plug in the middle makes the entire thing simultaneously a protest statement and an advertisement. The statement traveled everywhere. Wire services carried it. Newspapers on every continent printed it. Broadcast news read it aloud. A short piece of sarcasm published on social media became one of the most widely reproduced comments about Chinese censorship of that entire year. There is a small piece of fallout that is difficult to believe. The musician Zed stated publicly that he had been permanently banned from China after liking a post from the show's account. His publicist confirmed the claim to reporters while declining to say more. That detail closes the loop on the entire argument the episode was making. The episode said that access to the market comes with conditions that reach far outside the market itself. Then a musician with no involvement in the show, who wrote nothing and produced nothing, reported losing access to that market for tapping a button on a post about a cartoon. The 300th episode promoted inside that statement aired 2 days later, and the show did not soften anything in it. Nothing about the removal was ever reversed in any meaningful way, and nothing about the show changed because of it. The comparison that makes this clearest is the one the statement itself invited. The basketball league had something enormous to lose and behaved accordingly, issuing carefully worded statements, managing relationships, and attempting to satisfy 2 audiences with directly opposed expectations at the same time. It ended up satisfying neither, took sustained criticism at home for weeks, and still lost broadcast access for a period. The cartoon had nothing to lose and behaved accordingly, and the entire episode cost it nothing at all. That difference is not about courage. Parker and Stone have never claimed it was. It is about exposure, and exposure is a structural fact rather than a character trait. An organization that has built a substantial part of its revenue around access to a market will protect that access, and every individual inside that organization will make defensible decisions that add up to protecting it, and the outcome is predetermined long before anyone has to be brave about anything. The show's actual argument was never that the studios and the league were cowards. It was that the arrangement itself produces this result automatically, that everyone involved knows it, it, and that the only dishonest part is pretending the changes are creative decisions rather than commercial ones, which is why the removal did not function as a punishment. It functioned as a demonstration, performed at enormous scale, by the only party with the resources to perform it convincingly. Parker and Stone did not soften future material. They did not issue a genuine statement. They did not seek any accommodation, and no accommodation was available to seek, because the show was not on Chinese platforms in any officially licensed sense that could be renegotiated. There was no relationship to repair, and therefore no leverage to apply. That absence of leverage is the entire reason this episode exists. A studio releasing a $200 million film needs the market and will make whatever changes are required to keep it. A cartoon that makes its money from an American cable network and streaming rights does not need it and never did, which means the show was in the rare position of being able to say the thing everyone in the industry already knew and could not say out loud, and the punishment for saying it was the loss of something it did not have. The removal itself became the proof. The episode argued that criticism of a certain kind is not permitted, and that companies quietly comply to avoid finding out what happens. The country then removed every trace of the show, publicly, in a way that news organizations worldwide reported on for weeks. There is a final measurement worth making, and it is the one that puts this whole episode above every other campaign covered so far. By any raw count, this was the most successful attempt to cancel South Park in the show's history. Not 5 episodes, not one rerun, not a title. The entire series, every season, every clip, every discussion thread, every fan page, removed from the internet of a country containing roughly 1 in 6 people alive. Nothing else in this story comes within an enormous distance of that, and it produced less effect on the show than a schedule change at Comedy Central in 2006 did. The reason is the same reason that runs through everything here. Removal only works as a punishment when the thing being removed was providing something the target needed. The show had no revenue there, no distribution deal there, no audience it was being paid for there, and no ambition to acquire any of those things. The market did not exist for it, so losing the market cost it nothing. What it did gain was a story, told worldwide, about a government reacting to a cartoon by deleting the cartoon, which is a considerably better advertisement for the episode's argument than the episode itself could ever have been. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this breakdown, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The last serious attempt did not come from an advocacy group, a studio, a ratings board, or a foreign government. It came from a podium, delivered by a spokesperson for the most powerful office in the world, in response to an episode that had been finished 3 days before it aired. Section 10. The White House, Sermon on the Mount, and the Fourth-Rate Show. By the summer of 2025, South Park had been off the air for a long stretch by its own standards. More than 2 years had passed since the last traditional episode. The show had spent that period tangled in a complicated fight over where it would live, with competing corporate interests arguing about streaming rights and a great deal of money moving around behind closed doors. The dispute itself was unusually messy, even by the standards of media rights arguments. 2 large companies both believed they had claims on where the show should live. Litigation was filed, and the practical result was that new episodes stopped while lawyers worked. A program built specifically to respond to current events within a week was frozen for over 2 years by a contract argument, which is close to the worst possible outcome for a series whose entire competitive advantage is speed. That fight resolved on July 22, 2025, when Parker and Stone signed an arrangement with Paramount, reported at $1.5 billion, covering the existing library and new episodes going forward. The context surrounding that signature is what makes everything that followed unusual. In the months before it, the company had settled a lawsuit brought by the president over the editing of an interview on one of its news programs, paying $16 million. Legal commentators had been broadly skeptical of the underlying claim, and the settlement was widely read across the industry as a business decision made by a company that needed regulatory approval for a pending corporate transaction, rather than as a legal judgment about the merits. Days before the premiere, the network had also announced the cancellation of a long-running late-night program whose host had been among the administration's most persistent critics. The company said the decision was financial. A significant portion of the industry did not believe that, and said so publicly. So the environment into which this episode arrived was one where a great many people in American media were quietly asking whether large companies would keep permitting criticism of the administration, or whether the calculation had changed. Parker and Stone signed with that company, and then aired the episode described below the following night. The season 27 premiere aired the following night, July 23rd. It was the show's 329th episode, and it was written and directed by Parker. It was called Sermon on the Mount, which is a joke about the parent company's name. The episode was aimed almost entirely at the President of the United States, and the specific choices in it were not subtle. Donald Trump appears repeatedly with unusually small genitals, including in an official portrait he complains about. He is shown in bed with Satan, taking the position previously held in in the show's mythology by Saddam Hussein, and Satan rejects him. A public service announcement runs featuring an artificially generated nude version of the president walking through a desert. He sues the town of South Park. The story also involves the school bringing Jesus in to save the children from what the adults describe as wokeness, while Randy Marsh organizes a protest against it, and Cartman spirals into a crisis after concluding that wokeness has died and taken his purpose with it. Woven through all of that was material aimed directly at the show's own new business partner. The episode referenced the $16 million settlement Paramount had reached with the president over a lawsuit involving a news program. It referenced the cancellation of a late-night show hosted by one of the network's most prominent critics of the administration, which had been announced days earlier. It parodied the news program at the center of the settlement, so the show marked its first new episode in over 2 years, one day after signing the largest deal in its history by mocking the president and then mocking the company that had just handed it $1.5 billion. Parker later mentioned that the episode had come together 3 days before it aired. They had been reading the news, seeing material they wanted to use, and putting it straight in. That short window is standard practice for the series, which has always built episodes in about a week, specifically so it can respond to events while they are still happening. The initial broadcast audience was modest. Around 430,000 people watched the original airing on Comedy Central, which reflects how much television viewing had shifted away from cable by that point. Then word spread, and the numbers stopped being modest. Across Comedy Central and Paramount Plus, the premiere reached 5.9 million viewers in its first 3 days. Paramount reported that it was the show's best season premiere rating since 2022, and that it delivered the biggest share of a cable audience for a season premiere since 1999. The company also described it as the most social episode in the show's history and the most discussed program on television the night it aired. A show that had been written off in some quarters as a relic had just posted its strongest premiere numbers in more than 2 decades. The White House responded the following day, and the response is the reason this belongs in the story at all. An assistant press secretary named Taylor Rogers issued a statement describing South Park as a fourth-rate show. She said it had not been relevant for over 20 years and was hanging on by a thread with uninspired ideas in a desperate attempt for attention. She said the president had delivered on more promises in 6 months than any president in the country's history, and that no fourth-rate show could derail that. A separate statement provided to trade press took a different angle, arguing that critics on the political left had spent years attacking the show for offensive content and were suddenly praising it, and that this reversal exposed a lack of authentic or original material on their part. Reporting from an administration source described the president himself as seething over what was characterized as a childish attack. That is the entire attempt. There was no legal action against the show, no regulatory pressure aimed at it, and no request to the network. What happened was a spokesperson for the executive branch of the United States government issuing a formal statement about a cartoon, and in doing so guaranteeing that every news organization in the country would cover the cartoon. The specific wording is worth examining because it makes a choice that undermines itself. The statement's central claim is that the show is irrelevant and has been for 2 decades. That is a defensible position to hold privately. It is a strange position to announce publicly because the announcement is itself evidence against the claim, and everyone reading it understands that immediately. Nobody issues a press statement about something they consider unimportant. The second statement, arguing that critics on the left had reversed themselves by praising a show they once attacked, is a much stronger argument and happens to be substantially true. This series has been condemned from every direction across its run, and the direction of the condemnation has shifted repeatedly depending on who the current target is. People who called for it to be pulled over one episode have cheered a different episode a few years later, and the reverse has happened just as often. Parker and Stone have made that exact point themselves for 30 years, usually while being attacked by whichever side is currently unhappy. The show's consistent position is that it will go after anyone, that nobody gets a permanent exemption, and that anyone celebrating an episode should assume their own turn is coming, which meant the sharpest line in the White House response was one the show would have agreed with entirely. There is one more piece of the episode that deserves attention, because it is the part critics kept returning to. Cartman spends the episode in genuine distress, and the reason is that he has concluded wokeness is dead. For roughly a decade, the show had used him as a vehicle for exactly the kind of provocation that generates outrage, and his entire self-image depends on there being something to push against. With the cultural conditions changed, and with the institutions he used to enrage now retreating, he discovers that being offensive accomplishes nothing anymore. Nobody is upset. There is no reaction to Harvest. That is the same joke the show made in 2001 about a word losing its power through overuse, transposed onto an entire political era. A provocateur needs someone taking the bait, and when the bait stops working, the provocateur is simply a person shouting in a room. Putting that storyline inside an episode that spends its other half attacking the president is a difficult balance balancing act, and it is the reason the episode did not read as a straightforward political statement despite being received as one. The show was mocking the administration and mocking its own audience's appetite for watching the administration get mocked in the same 22 minutes. The response from Parker and Stone came the next day at a convention panel in San Diego, in front of a large audience and a room full of press. They avoided the subject for most of the panel. When it finally came up, Parker said they were terribly sorry. That was the whole response. 4 words, delivered flat, with no elaboration and no follow-up. And it is the same joke they made in the mock apology to China 6 years earlier and in the statement about Xenu nearly 20 years before that. When somebody powerful demands contrition, the answer is a perfectly formatted apology containing no apology whatsoever. The 4-word response also lands differently when placed next to the 2 earlier versions of the same joke. In 2006, they addressed a fictional galactic overlord and declared a million-year war. In 2019, they wrote a formal apology to a government containing an insult in every sentence. In 2025, they said they were terribly sorry and stopped talking. The joke got shorter each time, and the reason is that it needed less setup. By 2025, the audience already knew the format. Somebody powerful demands an apology. The show provides something shaped exactly like an apology, and the shape is the entire content. Nothing further has to be explained. What makes this final chapter different from everything preceding it is the position the show was in while it happened. There was genuine concern across the media industry at that moment about whether large companies would continue to allow criticism of the administration, given the settlements, cancellations, and pressure that had been in the news. That concern was the actual subject of the episode. The show used its first appearance in 2 years to point directly at the possibility that its own corporate parent might not let it say these things, and then said them. The White House statement then functioned as the closing argument, an administration responding to a satirical cartoon with a formal public statement about its relevance is behavior that confirms the relevance being denied. Governments do not put out press releases about programs nobody is watching. The measurable result was the largest premiere audience the show had drawn in more than 20 years, its biggest cable share since 1999, its most discussed night in its own history, and a season that ran with the new arrangement fully intact. The season continued from there without incident. When asked at the convention what the rest of it would contain, Matt Stone said there would be no politics, which nobody in the room believed, and which turned out to be exactly as accurate as most things either of them say to press. Looking at the whole run of these fights together, one pattern holds across every single one of them, and it is not the one people usually reach for. The common explanation is that outrage backfires, that attention is attention, and that trying to suppress something guarantees it spreads. That is true here often enough to be worth saying, but it is not really the mechanism. The actual mechanism is that almost nobody attacking this show has ever had anything to threaten it with. An advocacy group can generate press and nothing else. A ratings board controls a release once, and then the film exists forever. A school controls a shirt for 6 hours. A foreign government controls access to a market the show was never selling into. A White House press office controls a statement. In every case, the attacker reached for the largest lever available to them, pulled it as hard as they could, and discovered that it was not connected to the thing they wanted to move. The 2 exceptions prove exactly that point. Scientology succeeded temporarily because it found the one genuine pressure point available, which was a corporate parent with a film to sell and a star who could refuse to promote it. That was leverage, and it worked until the film came out and the leverage evaporated. The other exception is the only lasting one, and it did not involve leverage at all. It involved a credible threat of violence against employees, and it produced the only permanent damage in the show's entire history. Across nearly 30 years, the list of people and institutions that have attempted to stop this show includes one of the most litigious religious organizations in the world, a national Catholic advocacy group backed by a bishops' conference, its own parent company's board of directors, a movie star at the height of his power, a national ratings board, a broadcast standards watchdog, thousands of school administrators, its own network on multiple occasions, a federal defendant now serving 25 years, the government of the People's Republic of China, and the White House. The permanent damage totals 5 episodes, 4 of which had aired for years without complaint, and 35 seconds of a speech about intimidation that no member of the public has ever heard. Everything else is still there. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.